Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Jordan. I'm a composer, and this video marks the first episode in a sort of how they wrote series. And basically what I'm going to be doing is just going into various pieces in the repertoire and doing some compositional analysis. And I thought that this quartet by Shostakovich would be a really good piece to start with because I have a lot of string writing videos on my channel already, and so this would kind of elaborate on that a little bit because this is a wonderful example of really challenging writing, but at the same time very idiomatic writing. It's very, very well written, but at the same time it's very technically challenging. So I want to, especially in the second, third, and fourth movements, I want to demonstrate and kind of show what makes it that way and why it's not just like a poorly written piece that nobody wants to play. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So if you're not familiar, this piece was written in Dresden in 1960, and the subject matter surrounds the experiences of humanity during the horrors of the Second World War and under Hitler's fascist dictatorship. So obviously a very dark piece. And I want to focus a lot on atmosphere for that reason. I want to focus on use of motif with the DSCH motif. And if you're not familiar, that is Shostakovich's kind of signature. And you can see it, I mean, in the very opening here, you have various different iterations of that. And so it's just all over the piece. And so I want to talk a little bit about that and how he gets so much mileage out of that, not just in this piece, but in a lot of his music. And again, like I said, I want to talk about how Shostakovich writes for strings. And so first, I actually want to talk about kind of the large-scale form of this first movement. We're going to do videos by movement, so the next episode would be the second movement, next would be the third, etc. But for now, we're just going to be on the first movement, and I want to talk about the large-scale form of it. So I think there are basically three main chunks, and those are largely defined by their harmonic language. The harmonic changes are really the biggest landmarks of this movement. Stylistic changes, tempo changes, metric changes, we don't have any of that. We don't have any of that in this movement. And it's largely homogeneous in those ways, but the harmony does have some interesting inflection points. So let's just look at what those are real quick. Okay, so obviously the first large section starts at the beginning of the piece, imagine that. And that goes all the way till 4. And maybe you can guess, but this E natural has a lot to do with that. And we'll talk about that as we go through it. And then this starts the second section, sort of the middle section, and that continues all the way to rehearsal 9. And then at 9, we get sort of the same content that we got at the beginning, and then that goes to the end of the movement, which goes attacca into the second movement. So let's get rid of, well, maybe I can put this in a different color real quick so that we can define those. Okay, so those are our main sections. They are now marked in blue, and I will obviously refer to those as we go. But now let's kind of take a look through the piece. We're going to go basically rehearsal mark by rehearsal mark. So let's just start at the beginning here and look at what is going on. Okay, so as the key signature indicates, we are mostly grounded in C minor. And that bounces around a little bit, but we're mostly centered in C minor. And the first thing you'll probably notice is the very heavy use of the DSCH motif, like I mentioned earlier. And so if you don't know what that is, just very quickly, DSCH is just his way of signing his initials, and H in German notation is B natural. So, oh, and S, as in like ES, is E flat. So that's basically what all of that is, and it's just his way of putting a signature on his music. And he does it in a number of pieces, but this is one of the more heavy-handed instances of that, and you can read into that how you will, but I don't want to talk about too much historical interpretive stuff, because that it gets very, very muddy with Shostakovich, as I'm sure a lot of you know. And so it's kind of a cool thing to introduce the piece with these signatures in these different keys, because obviously, I mean, they're not all starting on D, E flat, C, B natural. That's a really good way to box yourself in if you're not going to transpose your motifs around. So he's immediately then got it in G minor, and the way you can tell what key it's in is by the third note, because it's kind of a re, mi, do, ti is sort of the format of that. So he's got a C minor one, a G minor one, another C minor one, and then an F minor. And so it's a really, really cool way to sort of have this fugato kind of texture, and it weaves a very interesting and very eerie atmosphere, because obviously after that motif ends, he can kind of break off and do whatever he wants. And at the end of each of these motifs, you know, these last notes, these are great tension points. All these final notes in each DSCH motif, since that is you know, T, whatever that really means in this context, but it's a very great tension point. It makes it a really interesting push and pull in terms of harmony, and the way that he deals with that with the other voices is really interesting as well. And so all of this is really strikingly morose, and so what contributes to that exactly? Well, for one thing, slow-moving counterpoint can do a really, really good job of capturing that feeling, especially in a minor key. I mean, even Bach fugues that are in a minor key can be very, very, have this very melancholy feel if performed in such a way. But I think that's a huge part of it, all of this counterpoint. I mean, and this goes on for a little while too, pretty much up until a little bit before rehearsal too. It's really just a bunch of counterpoint. I think the tempo marking as well is really interestingly indicative to performers. Why put largo here when you could put adagio? Because in terms of numbers, they do overlap a lot. But adagio has more at ease implications, and it has more relaxed implications a lot of the time. And largo is a very interesting choice, because largo means broad. And so for the performers, that in conjunction with all of this relatively faster moving counterpoint, I say relatively meaning relative to the tempo marking, it's interesting that he would mark the tempo in the half note. So how is the pulse meant to be felt? I think that's a huge contributing factor to this. But all of those things kind of come together to make this very dark texture. Another thing to think about is that there are pretty much no strong dynamic markings until about a minute into the piece. I mean, it's only three systems here, but it takes a while until we get to even a mezzo forte, and so it's very subdued. And I think doing things like that, where you really commit to your dynamics for a long time, really sells your emotional aesthetic of your piece. And so this whole section kind of meanders. There are a few iterations of the DSCH motif, but what's really interesting about this section all the way to rehearsal 2 is how you have these really interesting harmonies, and some that you'd expect to be really warm, but in the context, like what they're surrounded by, it gives them a very different flavor. And so a few examples of that, like in measure 7, this right here, I mean, it's an entire beat, and it's on a strong beat, and it's a D flat major 7. And you got the D flat, F, C, and A flat, but it does not feel like a D flat major 7, and there's not much use in calling it that either. Another instance is here at rehearsal 1 on the second large beat of the measure. That is an E major chord, but again, it's surrounded by this, G natural on both sides, and it's just a really, really interesting color harmonically. I mean, even this E flat minor chord right here, yes, it's a minor chord, but it it sounds different. It sounds like it's going somewhere darker than minor, if that makes sense. And the counterpoint contributes to that a lot, but also the surrounding motion of everything, the surrounding harmonies. If you surround a major or minor chord, even if it's just a triad, with all of these other, you know, really, really dissonant harmonies, and then put them in counterpoint, that's how you create this effect. So the point is that it doesn't really mean a whole lot to call these chords by their names in terms of function, because they become very, very distorted by their context. And so it's really just a long-winded way of saying major isn't just happy and minor isn't just sad. There's obviously more to it than that. Additionally, I think that when we talk about a lot of 20th century music, it's really important to suss out which harmonic information is relevant and which maybe is not so relevant. So for example, in this piece, I think a lot of that lies in where the basic key center seems and where things function as dominance. So finding, you know, big C minor moments in this movement, those are big inflection points. But for instance, if we look later on, if we have a C major thing going on, then that's probably relevant, because this is at a rehearsal mark. It's at the start of a new phrase, and it's got its whole section with a bunch of E naturals. So that is relevant harmonic information. What probably wasn't on Shostakovich's mind while he was writing this is that this is a D flat major 7 chord. At least I very much doubt that that was what he was thinking about, given that he wrote this in 3 days. Okay, so let's take a listen real quick all the way up to rehearsal 2. Okay, so another kind of important moment that I have yet to speak to starts right here, actually, where Shostakovich reduces his forces down to just 2 voices. And so this choice to reduce basically serves 2 main functions. One is to have transitional material that starts to differentiate itself a bit from what came before. And the other has to do with this stuff right here. We have our first mezzo forte, and more importantly, our first forte. And that's obviously a very important moment in this movement. And so if he reduces his forces before he delivers that, those dynamics and that entire moment has a much greater impact. There's also, in this section, 3-part rhythmic unity with these, and the viola is not very different from the other parts, but having that 3-part rhythmic unity also increases the strength of the first forte, and it lands on this really wonderful crunch with this A flat, creating a tritone with this D, and also creating a minor 9th with this G. Also check out my harmonic development videos if you're interested in that. But yeah, there's a really cool crunch there, and it sort of unravels itself because the second violin goes to this G here. I'm creating some really interesting imagery here. And the B goes up to the C, and it just all resolves really wonderfully on this diminuendo, which is just really cool. Yeah, so that's also a really interesting thing about that moment is how it doesn't quite just land on a 5 and then go back to 1. There's some unraveling to be done on an individual basis in the second and first violins. Okay, so let's talk about rehearsal 2 for a second. And the first thing I want to say about this is just to not be afraid to do this kind of thing in your own music. As you can see, the bottom 3 voices are just holding whole notes all the way until rehearsal 3. And that's actually, I think it can be a really great thing. Obviously, you don't want that for the majority of your piece, and maybe not even for a strong minority of it. But there are really, really wonderful moments where you just have a melody and just sustain underneath it. And that's all it is. It's a really, really cool effect. It's a great way to force yourself to develop your melody and not rely on other things happening in other voices. And if you can pull that off, then it's a really, really wonderful effect. I mean, there are literally like 16 bars here of just melody and sustain. So don't be afraid to have sections like that. Again, you don't want to have that for the majority of your piece, but don't be afraid of it. I think there are lots of opportunities in music to do that. And again, it's a really great thing if you struggle with melodic development to really force yourself to do. You can actually find an example of this in my own music if you check out my symphony. My symphony number 1, the 3rd movement, there is just these like high string tremolos and a timpani roll and this oboe solo that's like in a really slow 8 bars. And it's one of my favorite sections of the whole piece, and it's completely uncomplicated, so would recommend. And so if we take a look at the actual melody here, it's very meandering, it's very chromatic, and it's able to be that because of the support that it's getting from its 3 allies. You know, there's no question about what the center of the harmony is. It's, you know, 2 C's are being held down and then a G, a 5th above it. So there's no question about it. And so the melody is able to have this really harrowing effect where every note that it plays is juxtaposed against this wide open 5th. It's just so cool. I just really love this stuff. And the melody's chromaticism against the C's and the G, for example, in this moment here with this A flat against this G, I mean, it obviously wants to pull back down to the G. It just really adds to this really deranged and broken effect, and it happens again here, and also here on this F flat, which you would think would create a nice C major chord. This is kind of what I was talking about earlier, where yes, this is technically, everything right here is technically a C major chord, but it really is not. This F flat does not function the same as an E natural. That's, you know, partly why it's not marked that way. It's another really great tension point, and having all these notes be juxtaposed against those sustaining notes is just a really, really wonderful way to create that deranged and very lost effect too. That's a lot of what this chromaticism is doing. I mean, having an ascending A flat minor chord, I mean, there's no function there. It's just to sound lost, and it works really, really well. So let's go ahead and listen from rehearsal 2 to rehearsal 3. And so rehearsal 3 marks the start of a transition point from our first big section to our second big section. As you can see, I have this in blue, and I wasn't supposed to be using blue, but here I am using blue for stuff that is not related to form. LOL. So yeah, we're reminded of the first important motif of the piece, and we're also introduced to another really, really important motif, which is right here. in the first violin, the da 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 dee dum. I mean, that's going to get elaborated on a lot in the second movement. But it also gets elaborated on here. The second violin picks it up and it brings us into our next large section at rehearsal 4. So let's go ahead and listen to that real quick. Okay, and so now we're in our second main chunk of the movement, and this is largely characterized by E natural. I mentioned this earlier, but it's a really interesting thing because it's not quite C major. These B flats, these A flats, even D flats, so you got kind of a Phrygian thing going on, are ever present, and the E natural is really the outlier of the whole thing. But it does also create this very otherworldly atmosphere, and it's another situation where you know, half the ensemble is still just holding down this C. So every time an E natural happens, it is creating this really bright major third. So it's kind of a different thing where, you know, where we had kind of outlying major chords in the earlier sections that didn't really feel like major chords. This is really interesting because you can't really deny it. It feels bright, it feels major, but then it walks down stepwise to a B flat, and then an A flat, and then a G. It's got this really interesting whole tone vibe going on. And all the while, the second violin is uttering this second motif over and over and over, and then it sort of goes into its own counterline. And once the phrase restarts here, it goes back to doing that again, and you know, we have another phrase that's sort of on the same basis. Rehearsal 5 is pretty much just an extension of rehearsal 4. It's basically just another phrase with this same kind of stuff going on. But these sections are surrounded by such darkness, and it almost feels like the first violin is like trying to escape the rest of the piece that it's a part of. It's also kind of compounded by the second violin. Instead of just holding a G, it's now developing our new motif and just dragging it down, it seems like. And I think also what has to do with that is the fact that the first violin is literally moving downward. And so that's, I think, absolutely a contributing factor to that interpretive thing there. But yeah, that's just kind of how I see this sort of section. But the second motif, the note choice is really interesting here. Let me find a clean version of this. So here's one. The note choice is interesting here with this half step is the most distinctive interval of this motif. And it has a great tension point, and it always wants to just pull back down to the G because the G is creating that fifth with these two open C's here. And it's very directly contrasting this floating nature. Every time there's an E natural, it just feels like it's trying to float away. And so this directly contrasting that seems to bring this whole line like down to its level, or at least it's trying to do that. And so just a quick functional thing here is sort of implied earlier, but it's important to note that at rehearsal 2, and then kind of again at rehearsal 3, there are really only two main roles here. You have the melody in the first violin, and then everyone else is just sustaining. You have a few moments, like right at 3, the cello does something and the violin does something, but then it quickly goes back to that. At rehearsal 4, the number of roles has been increased to 3. So now only the viola and cello are sustaining. The first violin's still on the melody, but the second violin has that more rhythmic accompaniment using the new motif. And so that is important to note because it does keep things moving to have the second violin on a more accompanimental role rather than just a complete sustain. So let's go ahead and listen to that. And then rehearsal 6 here is another very powerful iteration of the DSCH motif. It almost feels like he's using it to punctuate or like sign off on a section of music. But this one is more powerful. It's using whole notes, sort of inflating the rhythmic vocabulary there. It's got complete rhythmic unison for, you know, at least 3 bars, and then, you know, it goes into this other thing where the viola kind of drags down and it unravels again. It's just like earlier. It's got some really cool part writing, actually. The middle 2 voices are just on this sort of chromatic descent all the way to their final their destination notes. The first violin obviously has, you know, just the basic iteration of it. It's the literal DSCH, and then the cello is always moving in contrary motion to the first violin. So it's just really great part writing, and I think the middle 2 voices really sell it. It just feels like it's just, again, just being dragged down. So let's go ahead and listen to that at rehearsal 6 just real quick. And rehearsal 7 here is really interesting, and it's one of the most difficult sections of this entire piece for me to interpret, because the brightness of the violin in rehearsals 4 and 5 with its E naturals is kind of now being brought to the rest of the ensemble. There's all sorts of rhythmic counterpoint going on. You know, when the violins are moving, the other 2 voices aren't really. And vice versa, like right here, everyone's sustaining and the cello's moving. They're just kind of trading off roles. So it's another long section of counterpoint, but the harmonic stuff is really interesting. And it feels almost like the only genuinely warm section of the whole movement. There doesn't seem to be any conflict or creepy undertones. That said, though, it is still harmonically pretty strange. All of the instruments are in their lower registers, and so it has this kind of earthy vibe to it in this warmer harmonic sense, and it feels a little bit more grounded. But the harmonic content has brightened from C minor into, like, right at rehearsal 7. We have these A minor chords, and so it kind of stays sort of in that vibe. I mean, the cello is descending chromatically, but it doesn't feel dark. At least not yet, because you've got this sustained A minor while the cello is doing that, and then they go, the 2 violins go up and more A minor, and so it's really interesting. And then they move from that up to F sharp minor, so it's even brighter. We're jumping by 3 sharps at a time from C minor to A minor to F sharp minor. Obviously, the music isn't really in any of these regions for a meaningful amount of time, but it does show this gradual brightening of the harmony. It's just really interesting to me. And again, the rhythmic counterpoint of this section is just really well done, and so it's something to kind of take with you from this piece. So let's go ahead and listen to that real quick. Okay, so I had to take a quick recording break real quick just because my camera overheated, and so I was moving some files around. But I just want to say real quick, if you're enjoying this, please make sure you do hit the like button and subscribe. It helps me out a lot, and I'm trying to get to 1,000 by the end of the year. So if you could help me out with that, that would be super awesome. Let's continue. Okay, so rehearsal 8 continues the same sort of atmosphere as rehearsal 7 in terms of its harmonic brightness, but it does ease up on the pacing of the counterpoint a bit. As you can see, most of the action is in the cello on these very chromatic lines here. What is kind of interesting about from 8 to 9 is that a lot of the counterpoint places more importance on the destination notes and just getting there chromatically, rather than what chords are actually being formed by each individual lineup of notes, if that kind of makes sense. So even if it's not chromatically, even if it's just stepwise, that's where the priorities seem to be. So for example, like going directly into 9, you have this ascending chromatic line going up to this G, and then this D goes down to a C sharp. This G sharp sort of prematurely arrives on its destination note on the G natural. And then this E natural goes to E flat, goes to D. So it's cool that the priority is on the actual chromaticism, and then, you know, here's the destination. I'm sure that was kind of what was in mind, and really for the second violin, that C sharp is just kind of a dip down. It's kind of a cool thing to think of counterpoint that way, and it can make it a lot easier actually if you know where your important moments are and what you want each voice, or where you want each voice to be in your important moments, and then just creating stepwise or chromatic motion to get there, and just seeing what sounds come out of that, because it can be really, really cool actually, even if you're not meticulously crafting every single lineup of notes, if that makes sense. And obviously, if you end up with a bad result, you can always go and tinker with it, but it can be a really, really good starting place. So let's go ahead and listen to that real quick. Pretty much the entire function of 8 was to bring us into 9, which is marking our final section. And so we return to previous material here. And it actually is, if I'm not mistaken, some of it is verbatim. Let me see. Yeah, like right before rehearsal 1. Yeah, right where this red mark is actually, right here. This is where the repeated material starts, right at 9. So yeah, it's a great way to mark, you know, the closing of a movement to return to your previous material. It is an abridged version that goes off kind of in a different direction, which is good, that it's not, you know, a copy and paste. You don't necessarily want that. And what is actually kind of interesting about all of this is that there's not much harmonically or melodically in common here with the stuff that happened in rehearsal 8 and rehearsal 7. It's similar enough in its subdued atmosphere that it's not too jarring of a transition, but I think what really makes it is that, you know, as I previously was talking about, the part writing right here leads into it perfectly. And so it's really just the same material. It gets reduced down to 2 voices again right here, and then going into 10 is where it goes off in a different direction. This stuff right here was not in the previous iteration of this material. It gives another one of these viola descent things that happens here and here. And then it sort of leads us into another DSCH iteration, sort of similar to what happened at rehearsal 6. It also restates the second motif, and that is right here. So that's really, really cool because, you know, obviously that's a motif that is going to be kind of the bedrock of all of the second movement. And so it's a nice signal that we're gonna be moving on to the next movement. It does a really, really cool thing here as it just kind of lays on this what was previously notated as an A flat right here. It uses as G sharp. That's because the next movement is in G sharp minor. More on that in the next video, but it's cool that it uses the actual note that was in the original iteration of this motif to go into the next movement. I just think that's super cool. Another interesting thing about this section is that in order to sort of distinguish this DSCH motif from the other ones, it makes itself asymmetrical. You have a half note iteration of it, and it sort of ends right there, but it doesn't fully unravel itself. It takes the length of this section in order to fully resolve, which is not how it was in previous iterations. It did it much quicker in the pace of quarter notes. And so having that be expanded and just like lying on that crunch of that dominant feel really distinguishes it from the other ones and makes this feel like the most important one. And so overall, we have this really monolithic movement. It's got 3 distinct harmonic sections, to me at least. Maybe you have a different sort of interpretation or analysis of the movement, but it's largely just very melancholy, and it's got this very dark tone to it, and it makes it a really, I'm saying really a lot, it makes it just a very unsettling prologue to this terrifying piece, quite frankly. And you'll notice that all of this music is rife with dynamic markings and expressive markings right here. We've got solos marked out to indicate to the performers to bring things out. You've got different articulation markings. Damn, forgot the word there for a sec. LOL. You know, and then tempo stuff like this, like a poco rit, a little breath mark, an a tempo. And these are not major, you know, earth-shattering markings in terms of how they affect the piece individually, but they all come together like this little swell right here, these swells here. All of these little things come together to bring musical nuance to the piece, and they breathe life into it. And so my final suggestion from this movement that this has to offer to us is to force yourself to do this type of thing if you're not already doing it. And it might come off as forced at first, but if you do it enough, eventually you sort of discover what comes naturally to you and how you want to express things with these kinds of markings. Because a lot of the music that comes from, let's say, less experienced composers is devoid of all of this stuff, and it feels lifeless because of that. So force yourself to do it. You'll develop an intuition for it, and it's absolutely worth it. And so that is pretty much all I have to say about this movement for now. But the next movement will be much more centered on the actual string writing because it's much more technically intensive. So yeah, we'll be more focused on that in that next video. But if you're still watching, thank you so much. I really appreciate you. Be sure to like the video and subscribe if you're interested in seeing more of this type of stuff. And yeah, let me know what kind of content you want to see from this channel. I recently got access to the community tab, and that's been a really wonderful thing. But yeah, just let me know, you know, what kinds of things you'd like to see in the future, and I will try to take all of those things into account. But again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.